Namaste students, how are you all? I hope everyone is fine. In the previous classes, we learned about China, two different phases, the rise of the Communist Party of China, Vietnam against two colonizers, emergence of Vietnamese nationalism, the entry of the US into the war. In today's class, you are going to learn some interesting developments about Nigeria forming unity against the colonizers. Dear students, do you know what learning outcomes we are going to discuss in this session? At the end of the session, you will be able to understand how colonizers arbitrarily brought together certain areas under their control, and we shall discuss, considering the wave of nationalism, how the British decided to hand over power to the Nigerians. Children, are you all attentive? Our learning outcomes are clear. Now, all of you be ready with your textbook, pen and a notebook. Pause the video and watch again if clarity is required. Place your queries in the comment box. Now, instructions are clear that what you should have. Shall we move on to the next topic? Here, we go with today's agenda. First, we shall start with words of the day, followed by pre-conceptual discussion. Later, we will have a discussion on British nationalism and the making of a nation. Finally, there will be a recapitulation. Children, are you all ready to gear up? We have a clear action plan to move on. Now, let me start discussing words of the day. Today's first word is found. Verb. Its textbook usage is, in 1936, the Nigerian youth movement was founded by Nnamdi Azikiwe. Its meaning is to start something such as an organization or an institution, especially by providing money. Its derivative is foundation, noun. Its usage is the organization grew economically since its foundation in 1955. Second word is contaminate. Verb. Its textbook usage is drinking water is also frequently contaminated. Its meaning is to make a substance or place dirty or no longer pure by adding a substance that is dangerous or carries disease. Its derivative is contamination, noun. Its usage is environmental contamination resulting from human activities is a major health concern. Children, it is quite interesting to learn 2 words a day. Now, let us have a glance at keywords which will be discussed in today's class. Inhabit, predominantly, populous, resurgence, multinational, spillage, ecosystem, susceptible, execute, weld. Now, let us recall what we had discussions in the previous class. The entry of the US into the war, Agent Orange, the deadly poison. Now, let us go into the topic. Nigeria, forming unity against the colonizers. Let us turn to colonialism and nationalism in Africa and study Nigeria and the West Coast. The country we know as Nigeria today was actually created by the British by bringing together distinct regions inhabited, which means to live in a particular place by different tribal groups around the Niger river system. Northern Nigeria is dominated by Hausa Fulani people who are predominantly Muslims, which means mostly or mainly. The southeastern part of Nigeria is dominated by Igbo tribes, while the southwestern portions are dominated by Yoruba tribes, while the southern areas are predominantly Christian due to long years of missionary activity. The story of modern Nigeria is the story of conflicts between these three regions amidst attempt at building a common democratic political system. The region of River Niger is one of the most populous countries of Africa, which means where a large number of people live, which has been suffering from different kinds of colonial rule. With the abolition of slave trade in 19th century, a new interest developed in trade in agricultural produce of this area, especially palm oil and cocoa. The late 19th and early 20th centuries marked as resurgence of racism in the British colonial empire, which means the return and growth of an activity that had stopped. Educated Africans were excluded from the civil service and African entrepreneurs were discriminated against. Herbert Macaulay founded the Nigerian National Democratic Party, the first Nigerian political party in 1923. The NNDP won all the seats in the elections of 1923, 1928 and 1933. In the 1930s, Macaulay also supported militant attacks on the British colonial government. In 1936, the Nigerian youth movement was founded by Nnamdi Azikiwe. It appealed to all Nigerians regardless of cultural background and quickly grew to be a powerful political movement. In 1944, Macaulay and NYM leader Azikiwe agreed to form the National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroons. Azikiwe increasingly became the dominant Nigerian nationalist leader. Independence and weak democracy. Considering the wave of nationalism, the British decided to hand over power to the Nigerians and worked out a complex federal system which recognized the autonomy of the three major regions. Nigeria became independent on 1st October 1963. Unfortunately, a just and democratic balance could not be worked out, and soon Nigeria slipped into civil war and military rule, which largely reinforced the domination of the north. Oil, environment, and politics. Oil was discovered in 1950s in the Niger Delta, and soon various multinational companies, which means existing in or involving in many countries, headed by the Dutch Shell company, acquired rights over oil drilling. Oil spillage, which means an act of letting a liquid fall off a container from oil wells, has a major impact on the ecosystem, which means all the plants and living creatures in a particular area considered in relation to their physical environment. Large tracts of the mangrove forests, which are especially susceptible to oil, which means very likely to be influenced, affected by somebody or something, have been destroyed. An estimated 5 to 10% of Nigerian mangrove ecosystems have been wiped out either by clearing or oil spills, destroy crops and aquaculture through contamination of the groundwater and soils. Drinking water is also frequently contaminated, and the sheen of the oil is visible in many local bodies of water. If the drinking water is contaminated, even if no immediate health effects are apparent, it can cause in long-term cancer. The situation came to a head in 1990 when an eminent human rights activist and environmentalist Ken Saro-Wiwa was executed by the military government, which means to kill somebody, especially as a legal punishment, despite international protests. Thus, you can see that Nigeria is still making efforts to weld together a nation, which means to unite people or things into a strong and effective group, work out a stable democratic system, and gain control over its material resources. How do you think the idea of Pan Africanism is different from nationalism? Do you think the idea of nationalism is limiting? Pan Africanism main motto is to bring all the African countries and tribes in the African region together. Nationalism is an ideology that helps a person to get their identity based on the nation in which they are residing. Undoubtedly, a continent is pretty bigger than a country. Nationalism is something that is different to that of uniting the continent. It is Pan Africanism. Pan Africanism, the idea that peoples of African descent have common interests and should be unified. In more general terms, Pan Africanism is the sentiment that people of African descent have a great deal in common, a fact that deserves notice and even celebration. Now, let us watch a video for better understanding.
Nigeria is a country on the western side of Africa. Nigeria, like India, was a colony of Britain and became independent after a long period of struggle. British colonialism and the making of a nation. Like elsewhere in the world, idea of national states was new even to countries of Africa. The country we know as Nigeria today was actually created by the British by bringing together distinct regions inhabited by different tribal groups around the Niger River system. Northern Nigeria is dominated by Hausa Fulani people who are predominantly Muslims. The southeastern part of Nigeria is dominated by Igbo tribals, while the southwest portions are dominated by Yoruba tribes, while the southern areas are predominantly Christian due to long years of missionary activity. Many people still profess tribal religious beliefs. The story of modern Nigeria is the story of conflicts between these three regions amidst attempt at building a common democratic political system. The legacy of colonialism remains with continued European control over its natural resources, especially petroleum. The region of River Niger is one of the most rebellious countries of Africa, which has been suffering from different kinds of colonial rule. From the 16th century, it was a major source of slaves of America. Tribal peasants were captured in the interior and sold to European slave traders. With the abolition of slave trade in 19th century, a new interest developed in trade in agricultural produce of this area, especially palm oil and cocoa. The British established their rule over the coastal areas in 1861 and developed Lagos as a major center of administration, trade, and education in Western Africa. It also became the center of residence to colonialism and the emergence of Pan-Africanism and Nigerian nationalism. The late 19th and early 20th centuries marked a resurgence were excluded from the civil service and Africa entrepreneurs, modern education and administrative modernization in the south, while it allowed the pre-modern traditions to continue in the north. In 1939, the British also separated the Yoruba and Igbo regions into western and eastern Nigeria and encouraged competition and conflict between the three major tribal groups so as to be able to divide and rule the country. In response to it, a section of Western educated intellectuals developed the idea of a common Nigerian nation and began to fight the British rule. Herbert Macaulay founded the Nigerian National Democratic Party, the first Nigerian political party in 1923. The NNDP won all the seats in the elections of 1923, 1928 and 1933. In the 1930s, Macaulay also supported militant attacks on the British colonial government. In 1936, the Nigerian youth movement was founded by Nnamdi Azikiwe. It appealed to Nigerians regardless of cultural background and quickly grew to be a powerful political movement. In 1944, Macaulay and NYM leader Azikiwe agreed to form the National Council of Nigeria, and the Cameroon's Azikiwe increasingly became the dominant Nigerian nationalist leader. He supported Pan-Americanism and a Pan-Nigerian based nationalist movement. Nigerian nationalism radicalized and grew in popularity and power post-World War II period as Nigerian economy faced difficult times. The backbone of this movement were the Nigerian soldiers who had returned from fighting for the British in the World War and the trade union leaders. In 1945, a national general strike was organized by radical nationalist trade unionists. The national movement was stronger in the more developed South rather than the North, and this created a North-South divide. Even in the South, nationalism was plagued by the ethnic conflict between the Yoruba and the Igbos. By the 1950s, these three regions also had their own anti-colonial movements led by regional practices. The Conservative Northern People's Congress in the north, the National Council for Nigeria and the Cameroons in the east, and the Action Group in the west. Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism is an idea which promotes the unity of all African peoples irrespective of country or tribe. This unity was to be used not only to fight colonialism and radical discrimination, but also to build unity among tribes and communities inhabiting the continent based on principles of equity, social justice, and human dignity. One key person in this regard was Kwame Nkrumah, a freedom fighter from Ghana. Independence and weak democracy. The British decided to hand over power to the Nigerians and worked out a complex federal system which recognized the autonomy of the three major regions. Nigeria became independent on 1st October 1963. Unfortunately, a just and democratic balance could not be worked out, and soon Nigeria slipped into civil war and military rule, which largely reinforced and domination of the North. Attempts were made repeatedly to bring in civilian and democratic governments, but these failed again and again. Corruption and suppression of human rights went hand in hand with collaboration between the military regime and multinational oil corporations which funded the corrupt rulers. After a long haul of military dictatorship, Nigerians elected a democratic government in 1999. Oil, environment, and politics. Oil was discovered in 1950s in the Niger Delta, and soon various multinational companies headed by the Dutch Shell Company acquired rights over oil drilling. Today, it is the most important resource of Nigeria. Most of the oil wells are owned by these corporations which have extracted Nigerian oil and shared part of its profits with the military rulers. But the common people have benefited little from this. In addition, reckless oil extraction without care for the environment by foreign oil companies has created havoc in coastal environment. Oil spillage from oil wells has a major impact on the ecosystem. Large tracts of the mangrove forests, which are especially susceptible to oil, have been destroyed. An estimated 5 to 10% of Nigerian mangrove ecosystem has been wiped out either by cleaning or oil. Spills destroy crops and aquaculture through contamination of the groundwater and soils. Throughout the early 1990s, popular unrest grew steadily, particularly in the Niger Delta region, where various ethnic groups began demanding compensation for years of ecological damage as well as control over their land's oil resource. This unrest manifestation itself at the outset as peaceful activist organizations that united their head in 1990.
Now, let us summarize what we have discussed till now. British colonialism and the making of a nation, Pan-Africanism, independence and weak democracy, oil, environment and politics. I hope you all have understood what we have discussed till now. In the next class, let us discuss a new lesson, national movement in India, partition and independence from 1939 to 1947. Thank you.